My stepmother convinced my dad to cut me out of his will. At the reading, everyone was shocked to discover what he really left me. For context, I'm Jake, 28 years old. My dad, Richard, passed away 2 months ago after a brief battle with pancreatic cancer. He was only 62. I'm an only child, and my mom died when I was 12. Dad remarried when I was 16 to Diane, my stepmother. Let's just say Diane and I never really got along. Growing up, Dad and I were incredibly close. He was my rock, my mentor, and my best friend. We shared everything, from our love for classic cars to our passion for woodworking. Weekends were spent in his garage, tinkering with engines or crafting furniture. Those were some of the happiest moments of my life. Enter Diane. She swept into our lives like a tornado, rearranging everything in her path. Don't get me wrong, I was happy Dad found someone after Mom's death. But Diane. She was something else. Always perfectly coiffed, nails manicured, and clothes straight out of a fashion magazine. She looked down her nose at our quaint hobbies and made it clear she thought Dad could do better than spend his weekends covered in grease or sawdust. At first, Dad tried to include her in our activities, but Diane would wrinkle her nose and find an excuse to leave. Gradually, our weekends together became less frequent. Dad started going to fancy dinners and charity galas with Diane instead. I tried not to resent her, but it was hard watching her slowly pull Dad away from the things, and people, he loved. As I got older, the rift between Diane and me only grew wider. She'd make snide comments about my choice of career. I became a mechanic, following in Dad's footsteps, my clothes, even the way I spoke. Dad would try to smooth things over, but it was clear he was caught in the middle. Things came to a head about a year ago. I'd been saving up to start my own auto repair shop, and I asked Dad if he'd consider investing. He was thrilled at first, but after talking to Diane, he changed his mind. She convinced him it was a risky venture and that I was just trying to take advantage of him. I was hurt and angry, and we had a huge fight. Harsh words were exchanged, and I stormed out. We didn't speak for months after that. I was too proud to reach out, and I guess Dad was too. Diane, meanwhile, seemed smug about the whole situation. I heard through the grapevine that she was filling Dad's ear with all sorts of nonsense about me, that I was ungrateful, that I only saw him as a cash cow, that I didn't really love him. When Dad was diagnosed with cancer, I tried to mend fences. But Diane was always there, acting as a gatekeeper. She'd tell me Dad was too tired for visitors or that he didn't want to see me. I managed to sneak in a few times when she was out, and Dad seemed genuinely happy to see me. But he was so weak, and our conversations were brief. The last time I saw him conscious, he squeezed my hand and said, "Jake, I'm sorry. For everything. I hope you'll understand someday." Before I could ask what he meant, Diane returned and shooed me out of the room. Dad passed away a week later. At the funeral, Diane played the part of the grieving widow perfectly. She even had the audacity to tell me, "Your father would have wanted us to get along. For his sake, let's try to be civil." I bit my tongue, not wanting to cause a scene at Dad's funeral. Then came the reading of the will. Diane was practically gloating as we sat in the lawyer's office. She kept shooting me these little smirks, like she knew something I didn't. As the lawyer began to read, I braced myself for the worst. To my beloved wife, Diane, the lawyer read, "I leave our house in the Hamptons and our vacation home in Aspen." Diane's smile widened. Additionally, I leave her our art collection and all of my personal effects not otherwise specified in this will. I slouched in my chair, feeling a mix of anger and resignation. I hadn't expected much, but it still stung to be so blatantly excluded. The lawyer continued, "To my son, Jake." I perked up, surprised to hear my name at all. "I leave my old leather jacket. You know the one." I blinked in confusion. The leather jacket? Sure, it held sentimental value. Dad wore it every time we worked on cars together, but it seemed like a strange thing to specifically include in a will. Diane let out a little snort of derision. "Well, I suppose that's fitting," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "A grease monkey's jacket for a grease monkey's son." I was about to snap back at her when the lawyer cleared his throat. "There's more," he said, glancing between Diane and me. "Mr. Walker left a letter to be read aloud at this time." He pulled out an envelope and began to read. "My dear Jake. If you're hearing this, it means I've passed on. I hope you can forgive an old man for his mistakes. I realize now that I let myself be influenced by others, and in doing so, I neglected the most important person in my life, you, my son. I know things have been strained between us, and I take full responsibility for that. I should have stood up for you, should have supported your dreams. I was weak, and I'm sorry. But I hope to make amends, even if it's too late for me to see the results. Jake, do you remember that old saying I used to tell you? The best things in life are hidden in plain sight. Well, son, it's time for you to start looking. With all my love. Dad. The room fell silent as the lawyer finished reading. I could feel tears pricking at my eyes, a lump forming in my throat. Diane, on the other hand, looked puzzled and slightly annoyed. What's that supposed to mean? She demanded. Hidden in plain sight? Richard, what game are you playing? The lawyer shrugged. I'm afraid I don't have any further information, Mrs. Walker. The instructions were simply to read this letter at the will reading. I sat there, my mind racing. What did Dad mean? What was I supposed to be looking for? And why the cryptic message? As we left the lawyer's office, Diane cornered me in the hallway. Listen here, she hissed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my arm. Whatever your father thought he was doing, it doesn't change anything. I'm in charge of the estate now, and don't you forget it. That ratty old jacket is all you're getting, so don't go getting any ideas. I jerked my arm away from her. You know what, Diane? Keep it all. I don't want your money or your houses or your art. All I wanted was my dad, and you took that from me long before he died. With that, I stormed out of the building, my head spinning with questions and my heart heavy with grief and anger. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my father, Diane, and the life they'd built together. As I drove home from the lawyer's office, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions and questions. Dad's letter kept replaying in my head. The best things in life are hidden in plain sight. What did he mean? And why leave me just the leather jacket? I pulled into the driveway of my small rental house, a far cry from the mansions Diane had just inherited. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, living paycheck to paycheck, while my stepmother was now sitting on a fortune. But I meant what I said to her. I didn't want their money. I just wanted my dad back. As I walked into my living room, my eyes fell on a cardboard box in the corner. It contained the few things I'd taken from Dad's house after he passed, some old photos, a few books, and that leather jacket. I hadn't been able to bring myself to go through it yet, but now. I sat down on the floor and pulled the box towards me. On top was the jacket, its brown leather worn and creased with age and use. I lifted it out, the familiar smell of motor oil and Dad's aftershave washing over me. For a moment, I was a kid again, watching Dad work on his beloved '67 Mustang, this jacket draped over his shoulders. As I held it up, something fell from one of the pockets. A small, folded piece of paper fluttered to the ground. My heart raced as I picked it up and unfolded it. Inside was a handwritten note in Dad's messy scrawl. Jake. If you're reading this, then you've taken the first step. Remember our weekend projects? It's time for one last father-son adventure. Start where it all began. Love, Dad. I stared at the note, my mind reeling. One last adventure? Start where it all began? What was Dad up to? Then it hit me. The garage. That's where all our projects started, where we spent countless hours bonding over engines and power tools. But the garage was at the house that now belonged to Diane. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Not with this mystery hanging over me. I had to go to the house. Now. The drive to my childhood home was surreal. The streets were empty, and a light fog had rolled in, giving everything in dreamlike quality. As I turned onto Diane Street, I killed the headlights and coasted to a stop a few houses down. The house was dark, no signs of life. Diane's car wasn't in the driveway, probably staying at one of her snobby friends' places, I thought bitterly. I made my way around to the back, my heart pounding in my chest. The garage had a side door that we always kept unlocked for easy access during our projects. I prayed that Diane hadn't changed that in the weeks since Dad's passing. To my relief, the knob turned easily in my hand. I slipped inside, fumbling for the light switch. As the fluorescent lights flickered to life, I gasped. The garage was exactly as I remembered it. Diane hadn't touched a thing. Dad's tools still hung on the pegboard, the half-restored Mustang still sat in the center, and the workbench was still cluttered with various projects in different stages of completion. I stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by memories. How many times had I walked into this garage, excited to start a new project with Dad? How many lessons had I learned here, not just about cars and woodworking, but about life? Shaking off the nostalgia, I forced myself to focus. Dad's note said to start where it all began. But where exactly? The garage was full of potential starting points. I walked over to the Mustang, running my hand along its sleek frame. This had been Dad's pride and joy, the project that had started it all. We bought it as a rusted-out shell when I was 14, promising Mom we'd have it restored by my 18th birthday. We didn't quite make that deadline, but working on it together had cemented our bond. As I circled the car, something caught my eye. There, tucked under the driver's side windshield wiper, was another folded piece of paper. My hand shook as I retrieved it. "Good job, son. You always did have a knack for finding the heart of things. Now, let's see if you remember how to pop the hood." I couldn't help but smile. Even from beyond the grave, Dad was turning this into a teaching moment. I reached through the open window and pulled the hood release. The mechanism clicked, and I lifted the hood. The engine bay was immaculate, a testament to the hours of work we'd poured into it. But there, sitting on top of the air filter, was a small red toolbox I didn't recognize. My breath caught in my throat as I lifted it out. It was locked, a combination lock securing the latch. But I knew instinctively what the combination would be: 0710, my birthday. The lock clicked open on the first try. Inside the toolbox was an envelope and a USB drive. The envelope had my name written on it in Dad's handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it and began to read. "Jake. If you're reading this, then you've taken the first steps on the journey I've laid out for you. I'm sorry for the secrecy, but I needed to be sure this information reached you and you alone. What I'm about to tell you will come as a shock, and for that, I'm truly sorry. I've made many mistakes in my life, son, but none greater than allowing Diane to come between us. The truth is, Diane isn't who she claims to be. Shortly after we married, I discovered some discrepancies in her background. At first, I dismissed them as simple mistakes, but as time went on, I couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Diane Miller isn't her real name, and her past is far more checkered than she let on. I began investigating, quietly at first. What I uncovered was a web of lies, fraud, and theft stretching back years. Diane, or whatever her real name is, has been running long cons on wealthy men for most of her adult life. I was just her latest mark. By the time I realized the full extent of her deception, I was in too deep. She had wormed her way into every aspect of my life, isolating me from those I loved, especially you. I was a fool, Jake, and I paid for it dearly. But I'm hoping to make things right, even if I'm not around to see it. On the USB drive, you'll find all the evidence I've gathered over the years. Bank statements, falsified documents, correspondence with her co-conspirators, it's all there. I've set things in motion, Jake. The will that was read today? It's a fake. Diane pushed me to change my will months ago, and I let her believe she'd won. But the real will, my true last testament, is in the hands of my old friend and lawyer, Frank Mosley. He's under instructions to wait exactly 1 month from the reading of the false will before revealing the truth. In that month, I'm asking you to finish what I started. Use the evidence I've gathered. Find the people she's hurt. Build an airtight case against her. When Frank reveals the true will, it'll be your chance to expose her for who she really is. I know I'm asking a lot of you, son. Especially after how things have been between us. But you're the only one I trust to see this through. You have a month to prepare before all hell breaks loose. Use it wisely. I love you, Jake. I always have, even when I was too weak to show it. I hope that someday, you can forgive me. Dad. I sank to the garage floor, the letter clutched in my hands, my mind reeling from the revelations. Diane, a con artist? A fake will? A secret month-long mission? It was almost too much to process. But as the initial shock wore off, I felt something else rising within me. Determination. Anger. A burning desire to see justice done, for Dad, for myself, and for all the others Diane had hurt. I stood up, pocketing the USB drive and the letters. As I turned to leave the garage, my eyes fell on Dad's old tool belt hanging on the wall. Without thinking, I grabbed it and buckled it on. If I was going to finish what Dad started, I'd need every tool at my disposal. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I took a deep breath. The game was on, and Diane had no idea what was coming for her. 1 month to unravel years of deception and lies. 1 month to prepare for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. I got into my car and started the engine, my mind already racing with plans. As I pulled away from the house, I couldn't help but smile grimly. All right, Dad, I muttered to myself. Let's finish this project together. One last time. The next few days were a blur of activity. I called in sick to work, knowing I couldn't focus on fixing cars when I had a much bigger repair job ahead of me, fixing the mess Diane had made of our lives. I started by digging into the contents of the USB drive Dad had left me. It was a goldmine of information, but also overwhelming in its complexity. Bank statements showing large transfers to offshore accounts, emails between Diane and various aliases she'd used, even surveillance photos of her meeting with shady-looking characters in out-of-the-way places. Dad had been thorough, I had to give him that. But I also realized I was in over my head. I needed help, someone with the skills to make sense of all this financial and legal jargon. That's when I remembered Sarah, my high school girlfriend who had gone on to become a forensic accountant. We hadn't spoken in years, but if anyone could help me unravel this web of deceit, it was her. I found her on LinkedIn and sent her a message, asking to meet. To my surprise, she agreed almost immediately. We met at a quiet coffee shop the next day. "Jake," she said as I sat down, her eyes warm but curious. "It's been a while. Your message sounded urgent. What's going on?" I took a deep breath and began to explain. To her credit, Sarah listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each passing minute. When I finished, she let out a low whistle. "That's quite a story, Jake. And you're sure about all this?" I nodded, sliding the USB drive across the table. "See for yourself. There's more, but I need help making sense of it all." Sarah plugged the drive into her laptop and began scrolling through the files. Her eyes widened as she delved deeper into the evidence Dad had collected. "This is... wow. Your dad wasn't messing around. There's enough here to put this woman away for a long time. But Jake, this kind of case. It's not going to be easy. We're talking about serious financial crimes across multiple jurisdictions. We need more than just digital files. We need witnesses, paper trails, corroborating evidence." I leaned forward, my voice low and intense. "Tell me what to do, Sarah. Whatever it takes, I'll do it. I owe it to Dad to see this through." Sarah thought for a moment, then nodded. "Okay. First things first, we need to track down some of Diane's previous victims. Your dad's notes mention a few names, we start there. We also need to get our hands on physical copies of some of these documents. And Jake. We need to keep an eye on Diane. If she suspects anything, she might try to run." And just like that, Operation Takedown Diane was born. Sarah and I fell into an easy rhythm, our old connection reigniting as we worked side by side. She took point on the financial investigations, while I focused on tracking down Diane's past victims. It wasn't easy. Many of the men Diane had conned were too embarrassed to talk at first. But as I shared my own story, as I told them about Dad and showed them the evidence we had gathered, most of them came around. Their stories were heartbreakingly similar, Diane sweeping into their lives, isolating them from friends and family, then disappearing with their money and leaving emotional wreckage in her wake. One of her victims, a retired banker named Harold, became a key ally. He had his own stash of evidence that he'd been too ashamed to bring forward before. With his help, we were able to trace Diane's activities back nearly 2 decades. Meanwhile, Sarah was making incredible progress on the financial front. She discovered a pattern in Diane's money movements that led us to several hidden accounts. We also found connections to a larger criminal network. It seemed Diane wasn't working alone after all. But as we dug deeper, the danger of our investigation became clear. One night, about 2 weeks into our month-long window, I returned home to find my apartment ransacked. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear: someone knew what we were up to, and they weren't happy about it. Sarah insisted I stay at her place after that. "We're in this together now," she said, her hand on my arm. "I'm not letting you face this alone." As the days ticked by, our case against Diane grew stronger. We had statements from victims, financial records showing her fraudulent activities, even audio recordings of her discussing her cons with her accomplices. Dad had been more sneaky than I'd ever given him credit for. But Diane wasn't making it easy for us. She had started liquidating assets, moving money around frantically. It was clear she sensed something was off, even if she didn't know exactly what. With just a week left before the real will was to be revealed, Sarah and I decided it was time to bring in the authorities. We took our evidence to the FBI, laying out the years-long con in painstaking detail. The agents were impressed with our work. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases I've seen from civilian investigators," one of them told us. "We'll take it from here. You've done a great service, but for your own safety, I need you to step back now." It was hard to let go, to entrust Dad's final mission to strangers. But Sarah squeezed my hand and whispered, "We did it, Jake. Your dad would be proud." The night before the true will reading, I could barely sleep. Sarah stayed up with me, talking me through my nerves. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "you've already won. You've honored your dad's memory and brought a criminal to justice. That's no small thing. As the sun rose on the day of reckoning, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I picked up Dad's old leather jacket, the jacket that had started this whole journey, and put it on. In the pocket, I found one last note from Dad that I hadn't noticed before. Jake. By now, you've uncovered the truth. I'm sorry for the burden I placed on you, but I always knew you were stronger than you realized. Remember, son, our real legacy isn't in money or possessions. It's in the lives we touch and the wrongs we right. I'm proud of you. I always have been. Love, Dad. With tears in my eyes and Sarah by my side, I headed to the lawyer's office for the second, and true, reading of Dad's will. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. Diane's reign of deception was about to come to an end, and Dad's final lesson to me was complete. Sometimes, the most valuable inheritances aren't measured in dollars and cents, but in truths revealed and wrongs righted. As we pulled up to the lawyer's office, I saw Diane's car already in the parking lot. Sarah gave my hand one last squeeze. Ready? She asked. I nodded, a mix of anticipation and determination coursing through me. Let's finish this. We walked into the office, the weight of the past month heavy on our shoulders. The receptionist led us to a large conference room, and as the door swung open, I felt like I was stepping onto a battlefield. Diane was already there, perched on a chair like a queen on her throne. Her eyes narrowed as she saw me, then widened in surprise when she noticed Sarah. Jake, she said, her voice sickly sweet, I didn't realize you were bringing company. Sarah's here as my legal counsel, I replied coolly. Diane's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up, but before she could respond, the door opened again. In walked Frank Mosley, Dad's old friend and lawyer, followed by two men in suits who practically screamed federal agent. Diane's face went pale. Mrs. Walker, Frank began, his voice grave, I'm afraid there's been a development regarding your late husband's estate. Diane's eyes darted around the room, like a cornered animal looking for escape. What kind of development? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Frank pulled out a document. It seems that the will we read a month ago was not, in fact, Richard's final testament. This, he said, holding up the paper, is the real will, signed and notarized just days before his passing. Diane leapt to her feet. That's impossible. I was with Richard every day. He never sat down with his lawyer without you knowing? You'd be surprised what a man can do when he puts his mind to it, Diane, I cut in. Or should I say, Angela? Or is it Melissa? You've had so many names, it's hard to keep track. The color drained from Diane's face. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. One of the suited men stepped forward, pulling out a badge. Mrs. Walker, I'm Special Agent Connor with the FBI. We have some questions for you regarding allegations of fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. Diane's composure cracked. She looked wildly around the room before her gaze settled on me. You, she hissed. What have you done? I stood up, facing her directly. I finished what Dad started. Did you really think he wouldn't figure out your game? He knew everything, Diane. Every lie, every con, every cent you stole. He just needed time to put all the pieces together. You can't prove anything, Diane snarled, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her fear. Sarah cleared her throat. Actually, we can. She placed a thick folder on the table. Bank records, witness statements, audio recordings. Would you like me to go on? Diane lunged for the folder, but Agent Connor was quicker. He grabbed her arm, while his partner moved to block the door. Mrs. Walker, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Agent Connor said firmly. As the reality of her situation sank in, Diane's face crumpled. Gone was the poised, elegant woman who had swept into our lives all those years ago. In her place stood a scared, cornered criminal seeing her house of cards collapse. I loved him, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. It wasn't all a lie. I really did love Richard. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Maybe you did, I said softly. But not enough to change. Not enough to be honest with him. As the agents led Diane away, Frank cleared his throat. Jake, if you're ready, I'd like to read your father's true last will and testament. I nodded, sinking back into my chair. Sarah squeezed my hand as Frank began to read. I, Richard Walker, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. Frank's voice faded into the background as the events of the past month washed over me. The late nights poring over documents, the emotional interviews with Diane's past victims, the moments of doubt and fear. It all led to this moment. I was snapped back to attention when I heard my name. To my son, Jake, Frank Reed, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all properties, business holdings, and financial assets. My jaw dropped. I had been so focused on exposing Diane that I hadn't even considered what would be in the real will. Frank continued, additionally, I leave to Jake my most prized possession, the 1967 Mustang we restored together. May it remind you of the bond we shared and the lessons we learned side by side. Tears welled up in my eyes. Sarah squeezed my hand tighter. Lastly, Frank Reed, his voice thick with emotion, I leave Jake a letter, to be read in private. Jake, my son, know that everything I've done out of love for you. I only hope that one day you can forgive me for my mistakes and remember the good times we shared. As Frank finished reading, the room fell silent. The weight of Dad's final words hung in the air, a mix of love, regret, and hope that left me breathless. After signing some papers and answering a few questions from the FBI agents, Sarah and I left the office. The bright sunlight outside seemed to mock the emotional storm raging inside me. What now? Sarah asked softly as we stood on the sidewalk. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Dad's leather jacket on my shoulders. Now we go get that Mustang. Dad and I have a project to finish. Sarah smiled, linking her arm through mine. Mind if I tag along? I've always wanted to learn about cars. As we walked to my car, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The past month had been a whirlwind of emotions and revelations, but standing here with Sarah, thinking about firing up that old Mustang, I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. Dad's final lesson hadn't just been about exposing Diane or reclaiming his estate. It had been about rediscovering who I was, about finding strength I didn't know I had. It had been about connections, old ones renewed, like with Sarah, and the enduring bond with my father that not even death could sever. As we drove towards my childhood home, towards the garage where that beautiful old car waited, I couldn't help but smile. Hey Dad, I whispered, how about one last ride? The engine seemed to purr in response, and for a moment, I could almost hear Dad's laughter on the wind. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in years, I was excited to see where it might lead. Epilogue. In the months that followed, life took on a new rhythm. Diane's trial made headlines, exposing a network of fraud that spanned decades. Many of her victims found closure, and some even became good friends as we bonded over our shared experiences. I used part of my inheritance to finally open my own auto shop, with a special focus on restoring classic cars. The '67 Mustang holds a place of honor in the showroom, a testament to the power of perseverance and the unbreakable bond between a father and son. Sarah and I. Well, that's a story still being written. But as we work side by side, her handling the books while I handle the engines, I can't help but feel that Dad would approve. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the garage late at night, I swear I can feel Dad's presence. In those moments, I run my hand along the smooth leather of his old jacket and smile. Thanks for the inheritance, Dad, I whisper. All of it. Because in the end, the most valuable thing he left me wasn't the money or the cars or the business. It was the lessons learned, the strength discovered, and the love that endures beyond the grave. And that, dear reader, is an inheritance beyond measure.